Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. Today we're going to focus on while loops in exercise 33. So last time we learned about for loops, and today we're going to learn about a different kind of loop. And of course, as always, feel free to follow along. So in contrast to a for loop, a while loop is structured a little bit differently. We're using while loops to execute or loop for a certain duration until a certain condition is met. So for loop would iterate over the loop a certain number of times, for example 5 times. And the while loop will continue until a certain condition is no longer true. So what we can do is with a while loop we can execute it, and then within the while loop itself we can have an if statement to check if the condition of the while loop is still true. If it is, we will continue looping, otherwise we will end the loop. So while loops can, however, have some problems associated with them. So it can happen that you have an infinite loop, so that a while condition is always true, and the while loop will go on and on and on for an indefinite number of time, and eventually your computer will run out of memory. And the program that we are writing may crash. So therefore there are some things to keep in mind. In general, if possible, we should typically use a for loop, but there are some scenarios where we may want to prefer using a while loop. So in order to avoid problems, there are some rules that are recommended. So first of all, we should make sure that we use while loop sparingly, and if we can, we should rather use a for loop if possible. We should also, when we have to write a while statement, or when it makes sense to use a while loop rather than a for loop, for example, because we don't know how often the loop will execute ahead of time, but it should only stop when a certain condition is met. If we are using a while loop, then we should always make sure that there's a Boolean test in there, so that we are checking whether the statement that we are comparing to eventually will be false, so that we stop the execution at some point. And when something is unclear about that, then we can just make a little bit a test statement, for example, and print out a test variable to see if we are at the bottom of the while loop and that actually our while loop would stop executing. So with that, let's get started with writing out the exercise script. And as always, we can switch over to our terminal, navigate to the folder where we want to work from, and then create a new exercise file. So I'm going to type out code and then the name of the exercise. Code stands for Visual Studio Code, which is a text editor I'm using. If you're using a different one, for example Atom, then you would write, for example, Atom followed by the name of the Python file. So in this case, exercise 33.py for Python. Now this is going to create a new file in here, and we start out by defining a variable as we did in the previous exercises, and we are going to initiate it to a value of 0. So it will be initialized as 0. And after that we have a list here, and we're calling it numbers, and it's going to be an empty list as we start out. And now we have the while loop for the first time. So while the variable I is less than 6, and then we add a colon. So this is the basic structure of the while loop. It's quite similar to functions that we learned about before, but of course, instead of using def to define a new function, we would use while instead. And then we have the block, the content of the while loop itself. So here we would now include whatever we want to have executed here. So in our case, we're going to print out using printf that we want to print out that we are at the top of the loop, and here the value of I is whatever it is at that point in time. And we are also going to append a new value to our list. So we learned about that before, so we can use the append function here to add an additional entry, for example a number here, variable, to our list, in this case to our numbers list. Next we're going to increment our I variable, so increase it by 1, and we will print out numbers now to see what the contents of our numbers list is. And finally here at the end of the while loop, we're going to print out what I is at the bottom of our while loop. And then of course, if we want to end defining our while loop, we would outdent again. And then finally, we just print out the numbers. And this time we're going to use a for loop to print out all the entries in numbers. We're defining the temporary num variable here and print out that value. So what's going to happen here is that we have the variable I defined at the very top and we set it to a value of 0. Then we have the numbers list, which is empty at the beginning. And then we start our while loop. And this condition here, while this condition is true, while I, which is a value of 0 initially, is less than 6, while that is true, we are always going to loop over whatever is indented here in our while loop. So in order to make sure that this is not an infinite loop, so that it actually will stop at some point in the future, we have to make sure that this condition here, I smaller than 6, at some point will be false. And to make sure that this is actually the case, what we are doing here is we're going to increment the variable I by 1. So each time we iterate over the while loop, it will be increased by 1. So it starts out at 0, then it will be 1, then will be 2, will be 3, so on and so forth. And when it reaches a value of 6, then this condition here, I, which is then 6, is no longer true because 6 smaller 6 is not true, it's false. So that's the point where we're going to stop execution. If we didn't have the statement here, then we would basically never stop. We would have an infinite loop and we would run out of memory at some point in time. And after our loop here, after the while loop, we are printing out the numbers and then we're printing everything that's inside our numbers list. So let's go ahead, open our terminal and let's actually run our script. So we're going to type in Python 3 space and then the name of the script. And now this is the output we get. So first of all, here we get, let's just scroll to the top here. At the top, I is 0. So this is the first print statement here where we're using printf to actually print out the value of I, which of course is 0 initially because we initialized it here outside of the loop to be 0. Then we are appending the value, which is 0 in this point. We are incrementing it. So now I has a value of 1. And we're printing out numbers now and the numbers list. And the numbers list now actually has the value 0 in it, which we see here. And then at the bottom of our loop, we're printing out the value of I again. But since we incremented it here, it's no longer 0, but it's 1. After that, we are starting from the top again, or rather we're checking if the condition is still true. So I now has a value of 1. 1 is less than 6, so therefore we loop again. And here we can see now at the top I has a value of I. We are appending the value of I, so which is now 1, to our list. So now in our list we have the values 0 and 1. We increment I by 1, so now it's no longer 1 but 2. And we are printing this out here as well. So now we are printing out at the bottom I is 2. And we repeat those steps here until this condition is no longer true. So if we take a look here at the last iteration, we see that at the top I is 5. Numbers now includes all the numbers up until and including 5, because we always appended those numbers here when we incremented them. Then we increase the value of I by 1 again. So now I has a value of 6. We print out at the bottom I is 6, and now our loop stops because 6 is less than 6. The statement is false, so we stop and then we print out the numbers. And here we loop over the values in our list 0 through 5 and print those out. So that's basically how we would work with a while loop and how we would iterate over it. And very importantly, of course, we always have to make sure that at some point our while loop will actually no longer be true, so it stops and we don't run into this infinite loop issue. Let's take a look at the study drill section. The first exercise here is to convert this while loop to a function that we can call. and to replace the number 6, which is here in our Boolean expression, with a variable. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So in order to define a function, we can type out def and then provide the function name. So let's call it maybe iterate, and let's pass in iteration, for example, as a value. And here, instead of saying while I is less than 6, let's check if it's less than iteration. And for this to work, when we call our function, we of course need to make sure to pass a value to it. So while I is less than iteration, we are going to iterate over that. And now to try out if that actually works, let's go ahead here and call iterate, and let's pass the value 6 to it. We save this and we go back and we execute our file again. Oh, and actually we also need to make sure that we pass the value of I to it. Or what we could do is we could just move this inside of our function. And we basically get the same output again. And we needed to actually have the variable I inside of our function definition, because here we are making a comparison. In order for that, we need to access the value for I. What we could also do is that we pass a second, or define a second parameter here, and then pass a second argument to our function. So here to have the value I, and then we would also need to make sure that we pass this in here. That would also be possible, but we can just add it basically inside of our function, and that resolves the issue as well. So now the second exercise, the second study drill, is to use this function that we just defined to rewrite the script to try different numbers. So we just executed it with the number 5. Let's now try it with, for example, an input of 10. So let's just run it one more time. And now, of course, we get a longer output here. We start again at the beginning with the value of 0. And as we iterate, as we loop through the iterations of our loop, we always append our list here up until at the very end here we have I with a value of 10. And we added all the numbers up until and including 9 to our list. Now at the opposite end, if for example we decrease this and for example just pass a value of 3 to it, then of course we are only going to have the values 0, 1 and 2 in our list, and we are just iterating over our loop 3 times. And that of course gives us a lot of flexibility, because now we can decide how often we want to actually execute our while loop just by passing an argument here to our function that we defined. The next exercise here is to add another variable to the function argument that we can pass in, that lets us change the +1, which we have here, the incrementer, on line 8, so you can change how much it increments by. Alright, so let's just call that maybe inc, for example, for incrementer. And of course we also have to make sure that we add it here to our function at the very beginning. So now we can pass actually 2 arguments to it. Let's just try if we pass a value of 1 to it for the value of inc, that it still works as before. The output should be the same. And we see it's the same output as before. But now we can change it, for example, and let's change it to a value of 2. So now each iteration we would increment it by 2. And now we have the numbers 0 and 2 included, so it's only 2 values in our list now, because when we are at the bottom of our while loop here, I has a value of 4 already, and that of course is not less than the value of 3 that we pass in here, so we would stop a little bit earlier. We could do the same here with a value of 10. If we do this, then we will have the value 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And if we change the incrementer here, for example, to a value of 3, or let's say 4, then of course we will have fewer entries in our numbers list, only the values 0, 4, and 8, because after that I has a value of 12, and that of course is not less than 10, so we stop execution here. Next, let's rewrite the script again to use this function to see what effect that has. Alright, that's basically what we did here. We already executed that and we rewrote the script to have the incrementer included in there. Finally, let's rewrite our loop to use for loops and range. Do we need the incrementer in the middle anymore? What happens if we don't get rid of it? So instead of using the while loop, we could rewrite that to use a for loop along with the range operation. So we could say here, instead of while I is less than iteration, we could say for I in range, and now we can pass a value to it. So we should have here the value 0 that we start out with, and then ideally iteration, which is the upper bound. And then actually we should loop over this from the value of 0 up until, but not including, the value for iteration, which for example in this case would be a value of 10. And right now let's comment out this and this line so that we don't increment it anymore here. And also we don't need to initialize I to 0, because that basically happens automatically in our for loop when we're using it here with the range operation, because in this case here for each iteration the value for I would be initially the first value, and then we would increment it here by 1 by default until we reach iteration as the upper bound. So let's take a look. We can see that now we are indeed incrementing it by 1. And we have here in our list all the values from 0 up until and including 9. But if we take a look at actually our function call here, we passed in the value for 10 and for the upper bound, so that's correct. But we wanted to have an incrementer of 4. That's not happening at the moment. We always increment by 1. So that's something we still need to implement. And actually, if we take a look at our range function here, it has an additional argument we can pass in, which is basically the step. So we should be able to do this by just passing in the inc here, our incrementer variable. By default, if we don't pass anything in here, then range increments by a value of 1, which we just saw. If we pass in a different value, a different step here, then the step variable should be used instead. So let's run that one more time. And now we can see we get the same output as before. So now we're incrementing indeed by steps of 4 in this case, because that's what we are passing in here. And along with that, we see we already get the correct output, so we don't really need those 2 lines here anymore. If we remove this line here and we uncomment this line here, where we're incrementing I, we are most likely going to get some really weird output. So let's take a look. So we're starting out with I here, and we are setting it to a value of 0 initially, and then we're incrementing it here by the step. So a step of 4 is what we are passing in here. So we have a value of 0, 4, 8, and then 12, but 12 is no longer included because the upper bound here is a value of 10 in our case. And the I here, if we take a look at that, actually doesn't have an impact. Let's just compare this real quick. If we comment that out to the output we get if we don't use this. Okay, so the difference basically is in this line here. So at the bottom here, we're printing out the value of I. And since we are now using the for loop, we increment the value of I only when we start the next loop, the next iteration of the loop. So here at the bottom, if we comment out this line, at the beginning, I has a value of 0, which you can see here. And we append that, of course, to our numbers list. And then at the bottom, I still has a value of 0. And only when we start the next iteration of our loop, then I is incremented to a value of 4 in this case, and it stays the same at the bottom as well. Only when we start the next iteration, then it will be incremented. However, if we do the following, if we uncomment this line, then the value of I will be incremented already within the loop. So if we take a look at this line here at the bottom, I has a value of 0 if we comment out this line or we remove it. But if we go ahead and we execute it again, we can now see here that at the bottom I now has a value of 4, which is exactly the value by which we are incrementing. So therefore here at the bottom, what happens is that we have a value of 0 that is set by the for loop, and we are increasing it by 4, and that's what we're printing out. But the value of I is basically not saved, so to speak, because at the next iteration I still has a value of 4, because the for loop basically changes the value for I again when it starts, and it sets it to a value of 4 again. We can probably best see that if we just manually change I to a different value. And now if we run it again, we can see at the beginning I has a value of 0. At the bottom I now has a value of 5 because we're increasing 0 by 5, and we're printing this out. Now if we start again, then I is basically overwritten again by the for loop, and I now has a value of 4, which is exactly what we are incrementing by. So therefore that we are changing it here just impacts basically the last line of the for loop here, where we are printing out what the value of I is. So long story short, we can actually remove this line. We don't need it. It's actually misleading in this section, and we can just print this out, and this is the correct output here. So we're getting the values 0, 4, and 8 in our numbers list. So as we just saw, when we are using the for loop instead of the while loop, we're actually saving a couple of lines. We don't have to initialize that value for I, because it happens automatically within our for loop, and we also don't need to increment the value for I, because that also happens automatically in our for loop as well. So therefore, actually, it can be a little bit more efficient to use the for loop, because we are saving 2 lines, but there are some scenarios, of course, where we don't know how often we want to iterate over a certain loop, and in those scenarios, a while loop is actually the better solution. Now finally, let's take a look at some common student questions. The first one is, what's the difference between a for loop and a while loop? So a for loop can only iterate or loop over a collection of things, which is basically what we saw here, where we defined what we want to loop over using the range function. A while loop can do any kinds of iterations that we want. However, while loops are harder to get right, and you normally can get many things done with for loops. Yeah, so while loops can be a little bit more flexible, especially if you don't know how often we want to loop over a certain statement, or if you don't loop over a collection of items, then a while loop can be the better solution. Otherwise, we should generally prefer to use the for loop. Loops are hard. How do I figure them out? So the main reason people don't understand loops is because they can't follow the jumping that the code does. When we are at the end of the loop, for example, we jump back to the top. When a loop runs, it goes through its block of code, and at the end it jumps back to the top. To visualize this, put print statements all over the loop, printing out where in the loop Python is running and what the variables are set towards those points. That's basically what we did here. At the beginning we printed out that we are at the top of the loop, and here at the end we printed out that we are at the bottom, so we always knew where we are within the loop and what the values are at that particular point of execution. Write print lines before the loop, at the top of the loop, in the middle, at the bottom, study the output and try to understand the jumping that's going on. So we could even go ahead a little bit further. We have a print statement here at the very end of the loop. We could also add one at the beginning or before the loop actually, and then you have everything covered. the line that's running before the loop, then the line running at the beginning and at the end of the loop, and of course, once we're done with the loop, in this case, we're printing out the numbers, colon, and then followed by the print statement here, which prints out all the values that are included in our numbers list. So that's it for while loops and exercise 33, and see you guys next time in the next video with exercise 34.